Hello, my name is Haydn Stevens, and I am presenting my paper on the Emancipation Proclamation and its effect on the American Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, and freed the slaves in the rebelling states. This proclamation is oftentimes viewed as the event that freed the slaves within America rather than the 13th Amendment. Unfortunately, this is simply just not true. Although it is true that Lincoln absolutely hated the institution of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation was as much about furthering and ending the Civil War as it was about ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation helped the Northern war effort in three primary ways. Number one, it simply just hurt the Southern war effort. Number two, it allowed for the recruitment of slaves into the Northern Army. Number three, it ensured Britain and France would not aid the Confederacy. As well as doing all of these things to help the Northern war efforts, it also reduced the odds of another civil war occurring in the future. It is true that Lincoln despised the institution of slavery. He was quoted saying, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." However, Lincoln was also a lawyer, and he knew that at this time he would not legally be able to abolish slavery in the entirety of the Union. This is primarily due to the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees people will not have their property taken without due process or just compensation. At this time, slaves were still considered to be property. So Lincoln could not simply abolish slavery in the Union. Because this was a time of war, he also would not have had the resources to provide people with just compensation. However, because the Confederacy was no longer part of the Union, they were not protected by the rights held within the Constitution, and for this reason, Lincoln was able to abolish slavery within the Confederacy. Lincoln discussed this in his first inaugural address, where he was quoted saying, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Gideon Welles also discusses a conversation he had with Lincoln in 1862 in his diary. He said, "It was on this occasion and on this ride that he first mentioned, he being President Lincoln, to Mr. Seward and myself the subject of emancipating the slaves by proclamation in case the rebels did not cease to persist in their war on the government and the Union." This shows that even in 1862, Lincoln had plans to use the Emancipation Proclamation in response to the Confederate war efforts in order to help his own war efforts. Finally, you can see in the Emancipation Proclamation itself, Lincoln has very specifically listed the states that are affected by the proclamation, and it is only the rebelling states, those in the Confederacy. The first way the Emancipation Proclamation aided the Northern war effort was by directly hurting the Southern war effort. Slaves played a vital role in the South, making up about 32% of the Southern population according to the 1860 census. What this meant was the Southern Army had a very large labor force to draw upon, and they did so using impressment, which is essentially forced recruitment. Colin Woodward stated that slaves were used for the building and repair of fortifications and railroads, and as haulers, teamsters, and ditch diggers. Paul Finkelman stated slaves grew the food for the army, raised and cared for the horses, and produced the metals and weapons necessary to fight. Essentially what this means is slaves were used to do everything that the Southern men didn't want to do, and it allowed them to focus more on fighting. What this also meant is that for every slave that then left and went to the North, one more Southern man had to stop fighting and complete these jobs, as they still had to get done. Slaves were also vital to the Southern economy, as it was heavily reliant on slave labor. Many Southern men felt that this farm work was beneath them and relied on slaves to do it for them. Drawing slaves out of the South hurt the Southern economy and reduced the number of men available to fight, as someone still had to tend to the farms, and if the slaves left, men had to come home from fighting to deal with those jobs. Just as the South had utilized impressment to draw on this labor force, the North also began recruiting former slaves into the Northern Army as they left the South. Lincoln had first discussed this in the proclamation itself, stating, "And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service." The North's primary advantage in the Civil War was its numerical advantage, both in number of soldiers as well as resources. Recruiting former slaves into the Army only furthered this numerical advantage. It also had the added benefit of former slaves being very valuable soldiers for two reasons. One, former slaves were much more motivated as they were fighting against the men that had kept them in slavery for long times. Two, Confederate soldiers saw slaves as subhuman, and being defeated by them in battle had a strong negative effect on Confederate morale. The final way the Emancipation Proclamation aided the Northern war effort was by ensuring that France and Britain would not join the Confederates. The Confederacy was desperate for European support. Early in the war, they attempted to force this assistance by placing an embargo on cotton, but this will be discussed further later. It was well known in France that Napoleon Bonaparte III favored the South. This was obviously concerning to the North, as it meant that he was already more inclined to assist the Confederate efforts. However, this was then furthered when Henry Hotz went to France and spread propaganda in hopes to gain their support. He did this in two ways. First, he reminded France of old Louisiana and French ties with the Confederacy through nostalgia. And second, he tried to make the Confederacy look like the victim, as they were just fighting for their freedoms. French support would have been dangerous for the North. Remember, the North's primary advantage in this war lied in the fact that they had greater numbers, both in terms of soldiers and resources. However, if France had joined the Confederate war effort, it would have mitigated these numerical advantages by providing both soldiers and resources to the Southern armies. In Britain, the Confederacy primarily used this cotton embargo in an attempt to gain assistance. However, Britain already had a surplus of cotton, and for this reason, this embargo was not very successful. They did gain a small amount of support in Parliament, but it was really only 2 or 3 people and not enough to be significant. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation changed the meaning of the war. Up until this point, the war had been seen as one of independence. Now, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the war was one of slavery. This was significant, as Britain had already abolished slavery in 1834 and France in 1848. Neither country was willing to support a war effort attempting to protect the institution of slavery. This change in the meaning of the war can be seen through the Southern war strategy. Initially, the South only fought when the Northern troops threatened Southern territory. This reinforced the idea that they were really fighting a defensive and just trying to fight for their independence. However, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Robert E. Lee began his Gettysburg campaign and took the offensive, driving deep into Northern territory. This showed that at this time, the Confederacy was fighting to protect the institution of slavery. Aside from aiding the Northern war effort, another goal of the Emancipation Proclamation was to reduce the odds of there being another civil war in the future. At the end of the day, the primary reason for the Civil War was slavery. Lincoln understood this, and he knew if he didn't abolish slavery, tensions over slavery would have risen again and ended another war. The proclamation was therefore really just a step towards the 13th Amendment in an attempt to avoid another war. In conclusion, the Emancipation Proclamation was as much about ending the war as it was about ending slavery. It did this by hurting the Southern war effort, allowing the North to recruit slaves into the Northern Army, and ensuring Britain and France would not assist the Confederacy. Alongside this, it also aided in reducing the odds of another civil war by taking steps towards abolishing slavery in all of America. Thank you.